Awesome. Hello, everyone. Today is December 20th, 2021, almost at the end of 2021. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API Working Group under SIG Network. This is a CNCF certified event, so please be kind to each other and let's have a nice productive day. Not much on the agenda today. Two major things I would like to talk about are review of the FQDM policy document to start, and then go over some of the, maybe start talking about some of the kept comments from CMP. So yeah, let's just hop straight into it. I can share my screen. Raul, is there anyone else coming from the FQDN folks side of things?
I'm not totally sure. Banu is here. Banu works with me on GK networking.
Awesome. Cool.
I think it might just be the two of us today.
Okay.
Holidays and all that.
No worries. Sounds good. Hi, Banu. Nice to meet you. Glad to see you here.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great. And then there's also another new face. Vivek, do you want to give a quick intro why you're here, what you're looking to do?
Hello everyone. Currently, I am a pre-final year student, engineering student from India, and basically my keen is towards this container and Kubernetes technologies. So I have been learning about this Kubernetes since from last 1 year, and so I thought to begin my contribution from network SIG networking. That networking is a quite interesting topic for me, especially in network, and so I thought to begin contribute towards in Kubernetes.
That's awesome. Great to hear. Well, feel free if you want to get involved. We have some good places to start, and I think anyone in the community is more than happy to help. So you can reach out in Slack if you're already there in SIG Network or SIG Network Policy API. And if you're already on Kubernetes Slack, feel free to reach out to me directly if you need anything. But yeah, great to have you. Okay, cool. So yeah, I gave this a read over the week. I don't know if anyone else had time to give it a skim. Yang, have you had a chance to look at this, or do you plan?
Not yet. Or could you share the link in the chat, or did you already do that?
It's in the agenda. Let me share it in the chat. I think we have talked about this before with you involved, so I think you can still provide some good insight here. I don't need to necessarily go over every little detail today. I just would like to kind of have a conversation over some things I gathered from reading through this Google Doc, kind of describing the KEP. Well, what we would see in a KEP for FQDM policy. Yeah, so really good job, Raul. I thought it was pretty concise. Like, you laid out some good possible, futures here. I think the biggest problem isn't necessarily going to be doing this. It's going to be how you end up implementing, FQDN policy in a fail closed manner, and also in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'd like to focus on. Like, I thought the spec, made sense. I don't feel too strongly necessarily about how you choose to organize the FQDN YAML structure and policy setup, but I think it's more about how you're going to implement this, right? So the two proposals you've laid out are new resource, or the possibility of adding a new egress FQDN set of rules to existing network policy, right?
Right.
So I guess we can start with proposal one and just kind of talk about it as a team, if that works for you.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Great. So the first proposal is creating a completely new resource, right? FQDM policy, that its goal, at least from my reading, is just to act as a egress policy that, same as a whitelist models network policy, i.e. deny everything and then punch allow holes to specific host names.
Yep.
So the one thing I did want to get into even before that, I guess, is talking about kind of the context of why we need this. Like there's a clear goal, there's a clear reasoning why we need this. Every CNI has their own implementation of it. But one thing I think we need to solidify here is like having explicit user stories, because I think you're gonna see that for FQDM policy specifically, the user stories are gonna be pretty dang similar to egress network policy rules.
Yeah.
Almost identical. And you know, that's a proponent of putting it into existing network policy, but then it brings on a whole nother host of things. So
yeah,
one thing I was thinking of is there's with CMP, there's a big hole, right? CMP is only addressing east-west traffic, really, in cluster traffic.
right.
And our goal in the future was to look at creating another object that addresses, you know, we call it a mode around a cluster, north-south traffic. And you have to look at both ingress and egress. Egress being much easier than ingress because there's so many ingress mechanisms in a cluster. So, you know, as I was reading through this KEP, like the first thing I wanted to ask is who are you designing this for? Like in your mind, are you going to see an application developer creating FQDM policy constructs, or is it more of a cluster level admin sort of thing?
I mean, I think at this point in time, I was envisioning a application developer or an individual service developer as the target audience for this. So in like the user story that I snuck in after I saw your comment, which, you know, thanks for pointing that out. It's a good gap. Like the basic one that I was targeting was just a user who writes an application and wants to say egress to certain external endpoints, but they don't want to maintain a list of IPs because that's cumbersome and kind of hard to read. And so they just want to say, okay, I want to tell you that my pods can talk to github.com. I don't want to have to resolve the IP manually and then put it in a network policy. So that was the initial story that I'm targeting here. I think I purposefully ignored the cluster admin one just because I wasn't sure how or if at all we were going to interact with CNP. So I kind of tabled that for the time being and said we can come back to that.
Right. No, that makes sense. The only, I think, I don't know what the standard would be actually in a cluster. Like in my mind, it would make more sense to have kind of a whitelisted set of host names at a cluster level that are allowed, rather than, you know, each application developer allowing certain host names, just because I don't know if that set is going to be that large, right? You know, in terms of how many host names we're going to have to allow in a given cluster, right? And is there a scenario where an application developer could inadvertently expose a pod to a malicious destination? Well, I guess not, because it's always going to be whitelist models, so it'll be more secure.
So are you thinking of this as like a story 2 or more as a replacement for story 1? Or maybe both?
I'm kind of thinking full stack, which I think is putting me in circles, but in my mind, it would be easier to write FQDM policy for the cluster admin, right? And do it in the sense of that missing object I was talking about earlier, like an egress firewall for the cluster. So FQDM policy wouldn't be its own resource, but the features you're looking for, so egress to DNS name, would be built into something like an egress firewall that acts as a moat around the cluster. And rather than an application developer poking holes directly in that moat, the application developer would have to ask the cluster admin and say, oh, I need to access github.com. Can you poke a hole? You could say, can you poke that hole? If the cluster admin wants to poke the hole for the whole cluster, he can, or he can just poke that hole in the developer's namespace, right?
Right.
That seemed like an easier route to getting this feature merged than creating its own object, which the more I read into it, the more I thought like it just seems like there's too much overlap with network policy to justify it being its own object, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Like in a perfect world, I would say, okay, let's do both. Let's put in FQDM policy to existing network policy and put it in some sort of cluster scope thing, just like we're doing with some constructs in CP.
Excuse me.
But I sat here today and tried to think of good ways to add this to network policy, and I still couldn't really come up with any that wouldn't be argued vehemently from both sides.
That's good. That's good feedback. Yeah, my only concern with the broader, I guess, cluster-wide egress thing has nothing to do with like a philosophical concern, more just like a practical constraints concern of if we start saying, okay, we want to build a egress moat, essentially, it feels like we've expanded the scope of this KEP rather substantially.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm just wary of getting pulled in a bunch of different directions right out of the gate.
Oh yeah.
It would be nice to try to constrain ourselves, make slow incremental progress rather than trying to swallow the whole elephant in one shot.
Totally. No, I agree. Well, then let's look at proposal 2. Maybe we can keep iterating that and see if we can get closer. Proposal 1, I mean, I don't know if other people have felt strongly about this. I was the first one to say maybe we should make a new object, but I have a feeling when we start writing out these user stories, there's just going to be so much overlap. Like, are we really going to have a new object for FQDM policies? And then what do we do if we want service selectors one day, right?
Right.
Make a service selector policy? No.
Yeah.
So that was my immediate gut reaction to proposal 1. Proposal 2 was adding a new type of rule set to network policy. And I liked how you used policy types to kind of fail this closed. Policy types was actually something we just talked about this week in a Google Groups chat. That's how they failed closed the addition of egress rules to network policy. So it was a good double use of that sort of, explicit rule types. But something that I found as a contradiction is that you did say it's just one more type of endpoint, right? And it is. And if it is just one more type of endpoint, then why does it need its own set of rules? Why aren't you just redesigning your network policy, the definition of a network policy peer, to absorb that one more type of endpoint?
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. And I mean, so in the section that I called it, like, why not add it to the egress struct, I'm trying to wrap my head around what that would entail. So basically my thought was, all right, if we tried to enhance the existing egress rule, we'd probably do something like have another repeated field called 2FQDNs instead, which would be a list of these sort of FQDN matchers or pattern matchers or stuff like that. And my main concern was just with the semantics of the to field itself.
Right.
So like if you have a missing or an empty to field, it's implied that you're targeting all endpoints.
Yep.
And so, for old CNIs, that would look like, oh, just open up this workload to talk to anything that it wants. Which like at surface level, I think that doesn't work, but that's a perfect thing of maybe we can brainstorm and see if it can't be tweaked more subtly.
And that's, yeah, and right, that's the $1 million question with doing anything to existing network policy, right? Is how do we handle that scenario? Because
yeah,
I think the main desire is that we say we're on an old cluster that has no idea about, you know, this 2 FQDN. In that, like you said, in that scenario, rather than us applying it and having to figure out after the fact if it works or not, i.e. the problem with status as well.
Right.
Because it's post-mortem. We just want to be able to apply it and fail if it doesn't support it. But I don't think that's possible. I know you could use an admission controller to do some fancy stuff, but in the CMP cap, Dan Winship basically just said you can't ever require an admission controller. Like if you want to build in validation, it needs to be built into the API.
Interesting.
So and that was something I didn't really know. So I'm wondering if there is some clever way to get around that chicken and the egg problem, right? Like if it was all right for us to apply this network policy and then look at it again and have the status say, oh, the server has no idea what an egress 2 FQDN section is. Like that may solve a lot of our problems, but I don't know.
I mean, I was trying to short circuit that entire conversation with the egress FQDNs thing, because in theory, what would happen is someone would apply the rule and it wouldn't do what they wanted. It would just fail closed, and they'd try to curl github.com and it wouldn't work. And then they would be able to then debug, but it wouldn't have punched a hole that we didn't intend to. So it would sort of force them to start looking. That was my hope here, is that it'll fail and then they'll start digging actively, as opposed to knowing that you need to check the status.
Right. And I think failing close is perfectly reasonable. And thankfully the whitelist model works really well for this purpose, because we never really trust the DNS, right? It's never a complete line of trust. So I'm trying to think of like negatives to this. I mean, my main one was logically it didn't make much sense in terms of treating it as just another endpoint, but it does kind of cleverly get around the upgrade scenario. Yeah, I guess the next point of view would be to try to get someone from SIG Network to also review this and say, okay, that would never work, or okay, this is a good solution.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think, Yang? Just off the top of your head.
To me, I feel like proposal 2 does make sense to me. Like if you feel like the egress and egress FQDNs sounds like the same thing but duplicated in different places, then maybe we can rename them. For example, we just call egress FQDNs as, I don't know, on top of my head, 2 FQDNs or something else, right? So people, when they look at it, you don't see this as 2 different egress rules. We see these as 2 different things, because they are essentially all egress endpoints, but they are entirely different in terms of selector mechanisms, I guess, because one is selecting pods and workloads in the cluster, and the other, as you put in the cap, they're not essentially looking at in-cluster services. For example, something like myservice.cluster.local, right? So that's not something that you're actually considering. You're actually considering external, DNS names, for example, github.com. So essentially, in most cases, the egress rules and the egress FQDNs will be selecting entirely different things, and they cannot overlap. So I feel like it makes sense to just, put those as two different structs. And as you just mentioned, it's perfectly solved for the for the fail open fail close problem. So I feel like this makes sense to me. I was also reading the disadvantage of the proposal, which is requiring existing CNI providers. To me, I feel like this is also fine because since we're doing the fail close thing, the worst thing that can happen is that when this first rolled out, some CNIs doesn't support to egress FQDNs yet, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem because if that's the case, when some people define egress FQDN's rules, the CNI will just reject, saying that I don't recognize this, right? So I cannot apply this. There's nothing I can do in terms of that regard. But as soon as because if this is a cap that we wanted to merge, just like the CMP, we definitely wanted one or two CNIs at least to be on board with this before we can actually merge this as a cap. And by then, if those CNIs already provided an implementation, then I don't think this is going to be a big problem because the CNIs who support this can basically implement it as already, and the CMPs, the CNIs that doesn't support this will just not support it, I guess, which is also fine.
Like an empty network policy won't affect egress FQDNs, just like we did with egress. You have to explicitly specify policy types egress FQDN if you're going to use it, or just apply the rules.
Right. That's right. That's an interesting point. Oh, right. I didn't thought of this because the policy types right now has ingress and egress, right?
Right.
So do you plan to add the egress FQDNs or whatever you call it as a third policy type, or no?
That's the current proposal. It's like a top level rule, just like ingress and egress.
Right.
No, I mean the policy type.
Oh no. I guess I hadn't planned on adding a new policy type.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head what the benefit of just using ingress and egress is that it lets us fail closed, I think. I don't know if adding a new policy type changes that behavior. I need to think about that a little bit more.
So the policy type field was added to allow them to fail closed with the addition of egress rules, right? So originally they only wrote network policy for ingress, and then they specified that if you write any rule that selects a pod, or any policy that selects a pod, even if it doesn't have any rules in it, so like it's totally empty, that there's a default deny ingress. But then they had to handle the upgrade. So they had to go from clusters that understood only ingress rules to now clusters that were also understanding egress rules. In that case, that original policy would read like deny all to ingress and egress. Whereas in the first instantiation of it, when there was only ingress, that's not what the user meant, right?
Right.
So they had to provide a mechanism for explicitly denying or default denying only egress. And that was the policy types thing. And that's what the logic's kind of funny. So like if you write just a standard policy with an ingress rule, it doesn't default deny egress traffic at all. But the only way to explicitly default deny only egress traffic is to provide an egress rule or to provide no rules and specify the policy type as egress.
Yeah.
So what I was saying earlier is like, I think you could use that as a powerful mechanism in the same way that egress network policy rules did it to fail closed. And I have the PR. I was actually just reading through it. the other day that will make more sense.
Right. I think what's going on in my mind is that if we don't actually have a third policy type, for example, we just have ingress and egress, right? And then what for a new policy, an FQDM network policy, it will look like policy type equals egress, and then you have some egress FQDM rules in there. But an OCNI, which doesn't really support this, will look at the network policy spec and read it as policy type egress, and then no rules basically, because it doesn't really recognize the egress FQDMs. Now, would that mean something different as what the user intend to mean? Because in that particular case, every egress will be denied if I'm not mistaken, because you just put the egress as a policy type and didn't provide any rule there. So it's default to deny any egress, right?
I think that's the intent, is that,
okay,
if I wrote a policy that only has like an egress FQDN rule that says github.com, then what I want is that my pods can only talk to github.com and no other endpoints.
And if they find out they can't even talk to github.com, that will make them start looking at it. That's your reasoning, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
It's like we'll close up all endpoints, and it'll just so happen that GitHub also doesn't work.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, if you want to explicitly deny all egress, you could either supply a policy type egress or a policy type egress at QDN. I mean, it overlaps there because the direction of the traffic you're blocking is the same. I don't know what upstream would want to do about that, right? Because you're right, you don't necessarily need to add a new policy type because
yes,
it's saying the same thing.
Yes, now I understand, but
then they're gonna say, why are you creating a new rule set that's saying the same thing?
No, I don't think it's necessary that it's something in the lines of when we're proposing the CMPs, and I really get a sense of the SIG network guys being sort of like when we introduce the implicit isolation or the quote unquote whitelist model in the network policy, we kind of like made a mistake there. And right now, even though I understand perfectly where this is going, I feel like the SIG networks guys just gonna say we understand this as well, but we're sort of like taking this mistake further, I guess. I don't know, because
no, I agree with you, but there's such an argument, especially for FQDN, because you just never trust DNS. So you want to be inherently only whitelisting, right? And I think it's very different from CMP, right? CMP right now, we're only talking about east-west in cluster traffic, right? We're sitting in that overlay. Our risk, we can afford to be a little less careful as a cluster admin, because as a cluster admin, we're only worrying about east-west traffic. We're less worried about there being, evil entities in cluster than we are about there being evil entities outside the cluster. So,
okay.
I mean, I think there's an argument here for the whitelist, which, trust me, I know I don't love it, implicit deny, but it being the developer that's the user and the fact that it's DNS are two rationales for advocating for it. Yeah, so that's where I'm at. I think this is well done. There's just a few questions that we need to answer, and I think you're almost there. If this is something that can be accepted or can get accepted, it also provides us a path to do the same for other sorts of selectors, which I don't know if that's good or bad. And yeah, I linked Dan Winship's wrote a KEP on this, kind of more pertaining to a moat around the cluster, called Cluster Egress Firewall, where he talked about DNS a little bit.
Yeah, I'll cherry pick a few more of Dan's comments there, because yeah, thanks for pointing it out. They are good context.
Yeah, and that kind of carries me into the last little bit I think we need to have ironed out here, which is, where is this implemented, right? So we talked a little bit about the fact that it's kind of a negative. Well, we said here it's kind of a negative that it forces FQDN to adhere to the default deny. I don't think that's a negative, but that it also requires existing CNI providers to implement. My inclination is that this is something that shouldn't be fully implemented in just the CNI. I think the CNI should look to a source of truth to resolve the DNS, and I think that source of truth should be or core DNS, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I saw in Dan's cap that he mentioned a core DNS plugin. I wasn't sure what we would need that for explicitly.
In my mind, it would be the root of truth of host name to IP, right? So all the CNI does is listen to, well, yeah, I guess listens to whatever IPs it's keeping track of for a specific host, right?
Okay,
and
so
then program the rules.
You'd feed it the FQDN selectors that you've gotten, and every time it resolves that DNS, it, I guess, responds to the originating querier, and also has a side channel out to you as the CNI, where you can ingest these IPs and then add them to your allow list.
Right.
Okay.
And the only reason I would advocate for that, like, it adds some overhead, I guess, but what you don't want is like super minute differences between CNIs related to the resolution of DNS records, like TTL constraints, stuff like that. Whereas if you still look to the CNI to implement the rules at a layer 3 level, but look to core DNS, which is deployed in almost every cluster, to resolve those host to IP, then it seems a little more streamlined.
Does it help with TTLs and stuff like that? Like, if it's still up to the CNI to, I guess, purge old entries, right?
I would think it would be up to the plugin, right?
Well, but the plugin can't control the actual data path allow list, right? Like, even if the data path, or even if the plugin tells you a new list of IPs, the CNIs also have to honor those new lists. They have to clean the old IPs, add in the new ones. So, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I just don't think it necessarily solves our problems. I think those problems are still there.
Well, all the CNI is doing in that case is reconciling whatever the plugin thinks to be correct. So, the core DNS plugin has a IP for google.com at 8888, and its TTL on that record is 30 seconds. After the 30 seconds is up, the core DNS plugin tries to resolve it again and sends the new IP over to the CNI, right? And then the CNI says, okay, these rules are wrong now. Let's reconcile. Let's program the right ones. And I'm not sure if that's possible, but that's kind of what Dan was referencing in his KEP in terms of how to solve the problem of extreme, this is something that's not easy to standardize across CNIs.
Yeah.
And that's what he was alluring to. So
I feel like, sorry, go ahead. No.
Yeah, no, I mean, the other option is, I guess, like an L7 proxy, which I think Dan also mentioned. It's more heavyweight for sure, but I guess certain implementations could choose to go that path.
So you mean L7 proxy in the cluster, in cluster L7 proxy?
Yeah, like that's, I guess sits in, I guess it intercepts all traffic, or I guess it would be up to the CNI to fine tune that properly, but that is another valid implementation of this, I guess, with its own trade-offs, obviously, but it's
Right. So would the L7 proxy be designed and implemented by the CNI? Or is that something that could be implemented upstream?
I think that's gonna be up by CNI, which is essentially what CM does today. They have essentially Envoy to do the layer, to do the egress FQDM policies, I think. Which is a full, proxy. So essentially it intercepts any DNS traffic and try to apply policy on top of that. But this FQDM policy for Calico is closed source, so we cannot tell, how they're essentially doing the FQDM policies. But I guess my point is, because we were talking about CNI implementations, the one thing that in terms of this cap, right? So we're just doing a cap where we don't actually necessarily care about how all CNIs try to implement this, but essentially we do need at the end of the day, we do need a sort of like criteria, I guess, a sort of a set of ETE test cases, for example, to make sure that the intention of this API type is getting correctly implemented by CNIs. So I guess my question will be: did you guys have any thoughts on how the ETE test cases, for example, will look like for such API types? So if we have those, then essentially we just have a standard to be enforced across CNIs, basically saying that you have to pass all those tests before you can say that your implementation complies with this cap, I guess.
right. And I guess TTL would be I guess it'd be a little finicky to write. I guess all of these E2A tests would be finicky to write, but that would be a good conformance requirement of just trying that out and making sure everyone plays nice.
So Yang, on Envoy, they do everything in layer 7, you're saying. So they have a proxy that intercepts all traffic coming in, and then will either let it pass through to the cluster or not. They're not programming like data path rules there.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think from what I saw is that they also do have data path things, but they also have an Envoy proxy, I guess, for other layer 7 things, which is a little bit weird to me the first time I read it, but right. I feel like that was the case for Cilium. If you can get in touch with any of the Google guys who are actually in the Cilium team, maybe they can confirm this. But I vaguely remember last year I was looking at the Cilium implementations, and they do actually have like a layer 4 thing where they do actively maintain host names to IPs and enforce those IPs in the data path.
Yeah, but you're right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That is what they do. They intercept DNS requests, and then the proxy is in charge of telling the data path the list of allowed IPs. I don't know how they do TTL reconciliation, but the proxy does do the populating of a policy.
Right. So at that point, you're not a true layer 7 policy anyway. Right.
Right. That's true.
No.
Yeah. I think that was just an open question that I thought the answer is going to be no, mainly because of that most of the time, and in most implementations today, we're just keeping a mapping. And secondly, that I know that we've asked SIG Network about layer 7 policy, and the overarching answer has been like, heck no. Like, we don't want to get into layer 7, basically, or pure layer 7, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I think generally you're on the right track. If we can get some of these open questions like a little more absolutely answered in this Google Doc, it would definitely help. I think, going back to the implementation, like Yang brought up a really good point. You either have a standard core DNS plugin responsible for doing the resolution, or you have a good suite of E2E tests. And I think either could be argued, right? In terms of if people ask, like, how are you going to standardize this behavior across CNIs?
Yeah, at the very least, I'll write down those two proposals or like sketch them out, so we can talk more deeply in the comments.
Cool. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks for doing all this work, though. I guess we'll just keep on chugging through. And yeah, if we talked about some of these questions today in the doc, feel free to, or I can go through and resolve some of these questions I had up, because I know we answered a few of them here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Any other questions? Around FQDN? It's another one of these funny things. It's like every CNI already supports it, but the process is so intense upstream that we can't figure out where to fit it in. And I wish we could make that easier, but anyway.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no easy way to do that. Anyway, cool. Well, thanks everyone who's working on that. Let's keep on chugging. After we get some user stories and some of these questions answered, I think we can go ahead and start looking at a KEP. If you don't want to take the time to start writing a KEP before we've gotten some loose approvals from the main players in SIG network, I totally understand that as well. You could give a quick presentation just outlining specifically this methodology, I'd say, to SIG network.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to maybe hash this out before we build a full-fledged KEP.
100%. Yeah.
There's a lot of boilerplate there.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I feel like it's also just like a CMP. It's gonna be quite an uphill battle, I guess, to just get this merged into upstream, because as Andrew said, I feel like there's a reason why, for example, CMP and FQDM policies, for this matter, are exist in every CNI, but are kind of not in the upstream as of today. It's kind of like you're just trying to pull up a standard that everyone just needed to comply to, and the standard is a lot of times cannot be very can only be very vaguely defined. It's really hard to be really exact on what the constraints are for this kind of things. So yeah.
Agreed. But I think you've done a good job of answering some of these questions. Like, this was clever for sure, and I think it has potential. And if not, then we throw it in the bucket, and you start kicking down the road of V2 and an egress firewall. And I'm not saying I know that that's like super daunting, right? And that's what you said at the beginning. You're like, I don't want to take on the whole overhead of looking at creating a new resource to absorb just this seemingly small feature, right? But if we had some super motivated and people with time, I think it could be done together and cooperatively and actually get pushed over the finish line. Because at the end of the day, all these new selectors and desired features would be easier to design in a new object, even though creating a new object is like pulling teeth.
That is true. Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, to be fair, this is a small feature on the API side, but it's not a small feature on the CNI side. It's
yeah. No, agreed.
Yeah.
No, this is like the implementation for this, at least in the OpenShift side of things, is fairly, I would say, extremely complicated, and there's a lot of failure modes that we run into constantly, which is I don't know. The CNI, the standardization will be that, and how you integrate it into network policy will be the two hardest questions to answer. Succinctly. Cool. Okay. I only have 10 minutes left, but really quick, does anyone else have any questions on FQDN or want to talk about something else before I use the last 10 minutes to talk about CMP cap?
Well, unfortunately, I probably have to drop in like 5 minutes, but we can
Okay.
definitely it's the last 5 minutes to talk really quick on some things. Maybe I guess set up a Google Doc or something similar so we can maybe collaborate on working on the PR to address his comments.
Yeah, I don't know what the best way to do that is. I
Yeah.
don't want to step on your toes.
No, I mean,
like I started just going through his comments at the top and making edits to the cap, and I've made it like down 15 comments or something.
Unfortunately, that's the same thing for me. That's why I wanted to set this up first so that we don't we at least see what our edits are, and sort of like combine those. So let's see.
Thankfully, I think you and I are probably the only ones doing it right now.
Right. Yeah.
So that makes things a little easier.
Mm-hmm.
Should we just look at, I mean, I don't want to copy each comment to like a Google Doc or something and say what we were doing.
No, I honestly feel like it's a little bit easier if you let's say you have some local changes already, right?
Yeah.
Maybe just stash them first, and then we just copy paste the entire readme.md to a Google Doc, and then you just apply your changes on the Google Doc in a common mode or something, and then I can do the same because I think I only have like 5-6 changes to the doc already. So I can see if my change and yours are essentially identical, so we can just use one of them, or if we do added some things together at some point, I just combine this on the Google Doc, and we just highlight the sentences or stuff that we added, and then we just go from there.
That works. That makes total sense. Okay. Do you want to make that doc first, or do you want me to do it?
I can make that doc first, and if it's easier for you, I'll just copy paste my already edited documents on there, and then I'll just highlight the sentence I added or added, and then you can just put whatever you have edited on there and combine those in any way you want. I guess just make sure to highlight anything that we changed compared to the current to the current version of it, so we can know what are the sentences we added or something.
Well, why don't I just open a PR against your branch and then merge it? I know it's like triple indirection. It's like a PR against your branch and then a PR against Abhishek, but I mean that would highlight the differences, and then we could just resolve them there and then move forward together in one stream.
Oh, that could work. Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, cool. I just send me the branch you're working on, and I can look at doing that. The only other piece that I will just go ahead and take care of is there was a bunch of comments on the diagrams.
Okay.
I'll just I have all those diagrams saved in my Google Drive, so I'll just edit those and fix them up.
Okay. I feel like the only way that I was proposing this is because I don't want us to go ahead and basically work on the same comments, and the wording is a little bit different, but we're essentially putting up the same work. So I feel like, yes, definitely you can work on the diagrams, so that I won't step on your toes in terms of that. And I'll probably do something like I'll work reversely up, like I'll resolve the last comments first, I guess. And then let's see, we'll just, open the PR against this branch together and see if there are any conflicts that we can just resolve them there.
Okay.
That sounds like a plan.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I'm just happy we got some review.
Yeah, it's quite some review.
Well, that's Dan Winship. I'm glad he did it.
Yeah.
At least he said at the end that this is looking good. Okay, cool. Well, I don't want to hold y'all, but
Well, I had a quick question. Just about the timelines for CNP. So I guess we're targeting this going alpha in 124. Is that correct?
what do you think,
Maybe.
Jay?
Hopefully.
Well, I can just say that's the hope. Like
Yeah.
at this point, I mean we're working on it. we want that to happen, but it really depends on if the other guys, for example, Dan and Tim, give a summed up by that point. Yeah.
What's the deadline for us here? Does anyone know the cap deadline for 124?
Good question. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but if you're right, if we're pushing for that, I should keep poking Sig Network with that in mind, saying, okay, here's the deadline, here's the deadline.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Let me figure that out and have it written down.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked is I also remember we were saying that we need a minimum of 2 CNI implementers for this to go alpha. Was that like before we can merge the object upstream, we need implementers, or how does that work?
No, I think it's not merge the cap, but I think it's move this to beta or something.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Oh,
I
I
think
see.
it's
So
either move it to beta or move it to V1 alpha 2.
Alpha 2, yeah. It's not merging this cap. Like we can essentially have nobody implement this, but have this cap merged.
Oh, I guess because it's just a CRD.
Right. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
I
But
mean, CRD is not even in the, I mean, like we still have to merge the CRD into upstream, right? Like,
yeah.
Right. Okay.
And then after I think at least 2 CNIs have implementation for this, then we can move this to V1 alpha 2. I think that's the point. Yeah.
Got it.
yep. Cool. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Well, have a good holidays, everyone. And I guess our next meeting will be
2022.
Yeah, it will be in
so.
2022. And actually, I think we'll look at what day that meeting is going to be. I might not be around that day, so I'll let you know accordingly.
Cool. What's your? Do you have any exciting plans?
I'm going out. Well, I'm headed out to spend the rest of the winter out west doing some snowboarding. So I guess that's exciting.
Yeah. Where at essentially?
Let me stop recording.